Please note that the views expressed on this program are those of the individuals who speak them, and not necessarily those of Portsmouth Community Radio, its Board of Trustees, members, volunteers, or underwriters. Good evening and welcome to Spirit Radio. I am your host, Willie Hassell. Along with my co-host, Lynn Nickerson, we will take you on a journey into the unknown, where the paranormal becomes the normal. A journey to a world cloaked in darkness, where reality becomes a thin veil. So sit back, relax, and join us as we venture into the shadows, the darkness, the unknown, and back. Good evening, everybody. You're welcome once again to Spirit Radio, the Paranormal Experience. I'm Willie Hassell, along with the lovely, the mystical, the mysterious Lynn Nickerson. Hey there.
That would be me.
That is you,
How
absolutely.
Are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Good. I'm doing fine.
Yeah, doing fine?
My cough drop is working. Cough drop is working pretty well.
Oh, is that
Don't you think?
Is that why you sounded a little bit different then?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
It's magic.
It's a voice modifier. Is that
It is
what
that.
it is? Okay. So, hey, we got a good show tonight, so I'll just shut up and start it. How's that?
Okay,
Yeah,
I'm all for that. Yep.
Sound like, yeah, you're all for me shutting up anytime, I know.
No.
Tonight on Spirit Radio, the Paranormal Experience. We welcome to the show Stephen Sakellarios. Stephen has studied Eastern mysticism since 1973, and in 1997, with his production company, Gold Thread Video Productions, he began production on a documentary on reincarnation titled Another Life, Reincarnation in America. The show was broadcast on PBS in Denver, Colorado, and accepted for distribution by Universities by Films Media Group. Stephen has also had several past lives of his own, including that of Matthew Franklin Whittier, the younger brother of the poet John Greenleaf Whittier. So let's welcome to the show Stephen Sakellarios. Good evening, Stephen. Welcome.
Welcome, Stephen.
Good evening. Thank you for having me on.
It's great that you could come to the studio. That always makes it fun.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I know.
The personal touch.
Yeah, we almost didn't mention he is actually here with us. So if anybody wants to ask him a question later on, 603-430-9722, or you can text that same number, 603-430-9722.
Well, aside from portals, or in addition to portals, I find reincarnation a fascinating topic. That's one of my other paranormal favorites. And what I wanted to make clear to the audience tonight, we're going to be talking about reincarnation and the proof thereof. But I want people to realize that this is not a preposterous idea. In fact, it's becoming a common topic in the mind, body, spirit category. And as of late, there's been quite a few books released in the past couple of years on this topic, 3 of which deserve mention here. And although tonight's show is not about them, they are good examples in support of substantiated and well-documented accounts of reincarnation. So the first one I wanted to mention is a book about little James Leininger, I believe is Leininger. The book is written by his parents, Bruce and Andrea Leininger, with Ken Gross. And little James, at the age of 2, kept telling his parents that he was a pilot, and he believed that he was a pilot named James Houston Jr. Then there's a second book out about little Christian Bird, written by his mother, Kathy Bird. And Christian believed, or told his parents, that he was once Lou Gehrig, and that Christian's mother was Lou Gehrig's mother. That is very well documented as well. And last but not least, another really interesting account, too, is a book by Robert L. Snow. I meant to mention, the title of the first 2, by the James Leininger story about the pilot. That happens to be called Soul Survivor. And the book by Kathy Bird about Christian Bird, her son, is The Boy Who Knew Too Much. And that's a story about Lou Gehrig. And then we move to Robert L. Snow's book. And Robert was a police detective, and he believes that he was the reincarnation of Carol Beckwith, who was the 19th century American artist. And his book was the portrait of a
past life skeptic.
Thank you, of a past life skeptic. There we go. So all three of those are very well documented accounts, and they're relatively recent. So Stephen Sakellarios' idea of reincarnation is not a preposterous one, and he's going to give us his evidence. He's done a great deal of research, so I'd like to dive in. The name of your two books, Matthew Franklin Whittier, in his own words, and the sequel, Matthew Franklin Whittier in his own world. Unfortunately, I didn't get to read that, but I have been doing a little bit of research on you.
I'll make sure you get them one way or another.
Yeah, I do want to read them.
Technical glitch.
So your story kind of starts with an account by a psychic who mentioned she felt that you were the reincarnation of a female writer from California?
Yeah, I mean, of course, you can take these things back as far as you want, because I had intimations of all this when I was a kid.
You did?
Oh, yeah. I don't emphasize it in my books too much because it doesn't really.
It doesn't apply.
It's not really proof, you know? But it was there, you know. Mm-hmm. I even remember when I was a kid, I grew up in Miami, but I had this thing about the quote-unquote rocky coast of Maine. I mean, I just wanted to see the rocky coast of Maine as a 3-year-old, you know, and I didn't have any reason. So it went way back. But yeah, I mean, it really kicked into gear when this psychic told me that I had been a writer, a female writer in the 1920s or 30s on the West Coast, and that I wrote serials, she said, and had some success at it. So I just, every once in a while, I'd start getting on the internet and looking for names of female writers to see if anything felt familiar. And eventually one did, but it led me to the 1800s on the East Coast.
Okay, so the woman you're talking about was Sarah Orne Jewett?
Right.
Now, you had a friend of yours who was also looking for information regarding the connection of the female writer, and he stumbled across Sarah Orne Jewett.
Well, I sent him the link to the Sarah Orne Jewett Text Project website. I sent it to him. And Jeff Keane is a fellow that has his own strong case, but I got to know him because he contacted me when I was doing my documentary, and I featured him in my documentary. So we got to be, you know, on a friendly basis. So, but I had noticed that the synchronicity level went up several notches when I was with him. I had some really interesting synchronicities, so I said, well, if anybody can find it, it's going to be Jeff. And he wrote me back and he said, I felt just pulled to this one part of the website where Sarah Orne Jewett's social circle was listed, and way down at the bottom was Matthew Franklin Whittier, and what they had on there was his picture in 3/4 profile, an etching, and they had that he was an author and that he was the brother of John Greenleaf Whittier, and that was all the information they had on him. I didn't know what kind of author. I didn't know that he had any traits in common with me at all, but I looked at those eyes and I said, that's me. You know, I just had that experience. I said, I just, particularly the eyes, I said, I just feel that I'm looking at myself. That's me.
What was it, what kind of synchronicities happened that led your friend to... Well, he brought that to your attention.
Yeah, I sent him the link to the website because I felt that it was familiar.
Oh, okay.
There was something about this woman and her writing and the name that was familiar, but I couldn't figure out what it was. That's all. I said, I'm not her. I'm pretty sure I wasn't this woman, but there's something real familiar about this. I'm close. So I sent it to him, and about a half hour later, I got the email back. It says, I was drawn to this. It says, he looks like you, and he was a humorist. I'm betting that this is it.
Do you feel that he's kind of psychic?
Jeff?
Yeah.
Yeah, in a strange kind of way. I mean, things just happen around him. It's like his psychic ability is projected into the world around him, and things happen, you know? Like, well, for example, I went with Jeff. He remembered a past life as General John B. Gordon, who fought for the South. So I went with him to a... what do you call it, a convention of Civil War buffs at the Antietam battlefield. And I filmed him there. And I happened to be talking about a relative of mine, Fidelio Biddle, and we're standing in front of the hotel, and an older man and a younger man are like 15, 20 feet away from me. And they said, "Did you say Fidelio Biddle?" And I said, "Yes." He says, "He was an ancestor of mine, too. It turned out he was a distant relative, and he called my mom, and they had a great time."
That's
things
cool.
like that would happen. Yeah, there are 3 or 4 things like that.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
All right, then. I was wondering if you could cover at least a couple of examples that indicate to you now at this point that you might have been Matthew. From that point, when you saw his picture, how did you pursue him and what he was all about?
Yeah, well, first off, as you can testify to, I look quite a bit like him.
Yeah, I wanted to get to that point, too.
So we've got that to start with,
Okay.
So what I did was I found a description of his childhood in the Life and Letters of John Greenleaf Whittier by Samuel Picard, who's the official Whittier biographer.
Oh.
At the beginning of that book, when he gives a little biographical sketch of John Greenleaf Whittier. Of course, they had the same childhood. So as he's talking about what the boys did, that's also Matthew. So that was the very first thing that I read about him. And not too much of it rang a bell, except they talked about the oxen and how the oxen were like pets and stuff. That registered, but I had an immediate thought, a feeling that they were offered up for sale by people that might slaughter them, and that I was very upset about it. And many years later, I confirmed that there was, in fact, an auction when Matthew wasn't there, a general auction, and they were sold in a general auction.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
So I mean, I don't know that they were slaughtered, but they were offered for sale in a general auction, and that I could prove. So, there's a lot of these memories, you can't 100% clinch them, but you can get pretty close to a level of plausibility, So that was just one of many. But that's about the only thing that arose for me from reading that early description. And I saw pictures of the house. That didn't look familiar.
It didn't look familiar?
No, because it had been renovated, but I didn't know that.
Oh,
the outside has been renovated, and then when I saw pictures of how it really looked, I said, "Oh my God, that's it." It was unpainted. It was, it was an old farmhouse. It wasn't this pristine thing that they created later. And then when I got in it, that's a whole other story. So at this point, I had that, and then I found there was a biography done by a student. Griffin, his name is. I can't think of his full name right at the moment. Lloyd W. Griffin. So when he was a student at the, and I forgive my pronunciation, is it Orono?
Orono.
Yeah, he was a student there, and he did a thesis on Matthew, and I read all of that, and what mostly rang a bell was the examples of his writing. He is credited historically with having written a satire. A fellow named Ethan Spike. He's known for that. And there were about 4 or 5 samples in the biography. And when I saw them, immediately I had the feeling, another one of these flashes, I said he used to embed a whole lot of code and personal references in these things, more than anybody realized. And that turned out to be true with Belzon. But I just had, I didn't even read them that well. As soon as I saw these things, I immediately had that flash.
Can you give us an idea of, the words and the codes? Because I know that there were things that were personal to him that came from his life, circumstances.
Well, a lot of it had to do with his first wife, Abby Poyen. And that she died in 1841 after just 5 years of marriage. But that was the love of his life. And so an awful lot of this stuff that's embedded in this relates to that relationship. Then there's the other things he embedded was that he was an abolitionist like his brother, and he was apparently very heavily involved in the underground, the Underground Railroad and the abolitionist movement. And he would write these travelogues that looked for all the world like just casual chatting with the editor of the paper. But he was really telling all the other abolitionists who his contacts had been. So when you look and see who he actually contacted, it's all these radical people, but he doesn't, he never mentions that they're abolitionists. I think Lewis Tappan, he talked about meeting him, and he said how he had made his own house and how eccentric it was and stuff. And then he would meet with people. I think he was a liaison for William Lloyd Garrison. So that's what I figured out, although I don't have proof for it. But he met with Daniel Webster, like right after Webster had helped get the fugitive slave law passed, which all the abolitionists thought was just really awful, which it was. So he met with him. And he talks about it in the travelogue, but all he talks about is the fact that they both had colds, and Webster showed him his fruit trees, and all that, just a visit, And then in one little sentence he mentions they talked about national events. See, but he was there as the liaison for William Lloyd Garrison. I'm pretty sure. He also met Victor Hugo overseas, not just as a casual talk. It was, again, he was liaison, So, that's another example. But the other thing he did was when somebody would steal his work, he would make snide comments in there, in code. And when I say code, I mean, for example, he would quote something. And then if you look up the quote, you'd find what he was really saying. Or he would quote something and leave a section out with ellipses. When you look up the quote and look at what's in between, that's his message. See, so he would make these snide comments, putting these people on notice. I know what you did, and this is for posterity. So it's another example.
Going from there, Stephen, you mentioned that Matthew wrote very seldom under his own name.
Right.
That he used different pseudonyms, aliases, or whatever.
Hundreds of them.
Why do you suppose he had hundreds of them? Why did he do that? I mean, I know he wanted to conceal his identity, but why could he have not chosen one or two? Why did he do that? Because that would be really difficult to trace down.
There's 2 or 3 different answers, and part of it comes out of my own feelings. One of them is that he felt low self-esteem about his writing. His brother was 5 years older. His brother was the man of letters, the one that the family sent to school. He couldn't compete. You know how the younger brother can't compete. So he becomes the Joker. Well, it's typical. That's exactly what happened here. Matthew becomes the Joker, the satirist. But he has he doesn't want to compete with his brother. There's another aspect of it that I think his brother had Asperger's. My personal theory is that John Greenleaf Whittier had Asperger's before anybody knew what it was, and he was sickly. And Matthew didn't want to compete with him because John Greenleaf Whittier's only chance to make it in life was to
be a writer. So that was his source of income.
So he didn't want to compete with his brother. As a matter of fact, Matthew published quite a bit before John Greenleaf Whittier did, even though he was younger. He was the junior editor, unspoken junior editor for the New York Constellation, which was the editor-in-chief was Asa Green. And that was in 1829 to 1832. It ended when the cholera epidemic got so bad in New York that I think they finally left New York. But he would publish his brother's poetry to help him get established.
So
when I started looking through the Constellation, I started seeing these old poems by John Greenleaf Whittier. And I'm sure it was Matthew because he was the de facto editor of the paper, so he was getting his stuff in. He was also getting Oliver Wendell Holmes' poetry in, and he was personal friends with Oliver Wendell Holmes. So he was getting his friend's stuff published in that paper.
That's very cool.
Yeah, I forget our original question. I don't remember where I was going with that.
How on earth do you track down an author of something when he's got so many different names?
Why did you? Yeah, we'll do that, and also why did you do the pseudonym? Because I haven't really touched on all the reasons. There was also a Victorian ethic that one should avoid pride. And the way to avoid pride was to make sure that all your work was anonymous. So there was a whole lot of people that were publishing anonymously. Pseudonyms was a big deal back then, and partly it was to be modest. And I think that his wife really pushed this also because she was even stronger about it. So I think she
being modest,
being modest, because she was really like a card-carrying Victorian as well as being a very spiritual person. And I think she made him promise. I feel that, and on her deathbed, she made him promise because she was also psychic, and she could see what would happen to him if he became famous. I think, so she made him promise to avoid fame. See, and not to. I think there's that. I can't prove it. But the other reason is, again, that he was so heavily involved in abolitionist work.
He wanted to maintain his anonymity.
And I have evidence of that. I mean, he said as much, that they would tar and feather him at the best if these people were after him, see. So he had to be very cagey about who he was. And to the point where when other people when the rumor would go about that somebody else was writing his travelogue or whatever, or his series, he would let them. He would make snide comments for posterity or for those in the know, so he's left a trace to where you can tell that he was the real author, but you have to know what you're looking for. But for the general public, he would humor them.
Yeah.
He would let it go because it deepened his cover.
At what point do you suppose it became in vogue to assign your name to a work, a written published work?
Well, I think when people figured out that it left you open to plagiarism, in other words, the plagiarists would look for people who were not protecting themselves, who were good but weren't really known, and they would get it published first in their name. And once you had it in black and white in your name, you had it.
Yeah,
Nobody
whether
could
it was yours or
dispute
not.
that.
Yeah,
because there weren't really good copyright laws, and you could come out and say that's mine, but nobody would believe you, especially if the person was famous.
Yeah,
or getting famous.
Okay, well. Yeah. What I'd like to do is get into that plagiarism issue when we come back, but I did want to cover a couple of the other areas having to do with some of the theories about reincarnation, and I would say there's maybe 3 out there, and one of them is recognizing a past life personage that has to do, one theory in recognizing a past life personage has to do with your mind personality having direct access to a collective consciousness, and that some of the past life info may come from this collective consciousness. That's one of the thoughts.
Right.
A second one, which is expressed by Dr. Stephen D. Farmer, and he wrote, hang on just a second here, Healing Ancestral Karma, Free Yourself from Unhealthy Family Patterns. He wrote, as I lose my notes, that he thinks that ancestral DNA played a part in the recognition process of a former self, but that's strictly going on the fact that there might have been some physical relation to a forefather, to a forebear. But Dr. Farmer brings up the idea that past life events are possibly embedded in the cells of our DNA, hence there would be some cell memory. And then to directly quote from Dr. Farmer, just to clarify this thought. Okay. He writes, one area where paradox exists in the relationship between past lives and ancestors, because I've come to the conclusion that the vast majority of past life memories and ancestral memories are one and the same. We retain some shards of ancestral memories that continue to dwell in our being, and somewhere in our DNA that can be awakened and brought into conscious awareness through hypnotic regression, shamanic journeys, dreams, or other means. And then he goes on to say it's entirely possible that one or more of your ancestors may be you. And he did cite an example of a man going on a shamanic journey, and he was introduced to a forebear that was himself in a former life. So that's really interesting. And then the third theory has to do simply with accessing I was just going to say the collective consciousness, but I've really said that already. It's really a different aspect that I wanted to point out. And, of course, why don't you comment on the first and second one, and then we'll get to the third.
Yeah. Well, first of all, there certainly are a lot of cases where people reincarnate back into their families. Carol Bowman's second book was called Return from Heaven, and she has some very strong examples of that in there. And I ran across one on YouTube the other day, a fellow whose brother reincarnated as his son, and he has some evidence for that. So that happens. Yeah, no question. And now as to whether it's DNA or what it is, I tend to think that, I mean, when I was a lot younger, I thought in more black and white terms. It's either true or it's not true. But what I found is that usually there's some truth in what anybody says. So
that's true.
I think I would tend to think that I would emphasize it less than what Dr. Farmer does. But there may be cellular memory. I don't know. And as far as the Akashic record or some kind of large cosmic database that people are accessing, I think my case is a very good one for that, because my experience of this is it's very personal. I am Matthew Franklin Whittier. As a matter of fact, the more that and I love the way that Willie pronounces it, because that's the way he pronounced it, Whittier. I can't do it. I can feel the accent, but I can't make this brain and tongue do it, but I can feel it, and it feels very familiar.
Whittier.
Yeah, exactly. That's the way he pronounced it. See? So it's very personal. And the more, as I immerse myself into Matthew's writing in particular, I start to feel, at least subconsciously, in terms of my identity, I start to feel about half.
A real familiarity with it.
I mean, I really start to feel that I am Matthew. But it's the subconscious feeling. I don't get that many cognitive memories, but I get the sense of it, of his personality. So
like Matthew once removed, because you still have yourself intact, but things about Matthew just are very familiar to you.
Yeah, I remember, when I read his writing, it's hard to explain, but I remember the process of writing it. I remember why I wrote it. I remember what I felt when I wrote it. I remember the way my mind was working when I wrote it. I remember the parts that I particularly liked, that I was really pleased with. All that comes back to me, but the actual, like, where I was, what pen I was using, what room I was in, what people were there, I don't remember any of that. But so I've concluded, just from all of this evidence and my experience of it, that the higher mind is the same. And the emotions are the same. The only thing that's changed is the body and the physical personality, because you don't have the same brain. And apparently a lot of your memories are downloaded into the physical brain. They don't come from there, but apparently they're downloaded into it. And you have all these associations. So if I, for example, in Portland, I drive by Back Cove, which is a big huge tidal estuary that drains into a huge mud flat periodically as the tides come up and down, I look at that. My associations to that are my present life ones, that I've walked around it, that Hannaford's grocery store is across the street from it, that you have to drive here, the name of the street. That's my associations, because this is my lifetime. Matthew's associations were totally different. And I was at the Portland room doing a little bit of research. That's in the Portland Public Library, and somebody mentioned that I think in the old day they used to think of Back Cove as an eyesore. That triggered something. I said, it's a big mud flat. That's what Matthew thought of it. See?
Yeah.
So totally different associations. So that part of the personality is missing. See, but the higher mind, the what's humorous, the way your mind works, the turn of phrase, all that's the same.
Well, Matthew was, a product of his own time, so there were things in place then and ways of saying things that aren't now.
Exactly.
But the feelings remain.
Yeah.
I think you always have to go with the feelings.
Yeah.
So what I was getting at is, the first one was the DNA. The second theory has to do with the collective consciousness, or accessing it. Or my third theory has to do with what the higher mind idea. Whatever your personality signature is, all of your past lives and you are encapsulated in that. And I think it is part of you at different frequencies. There's also the thought of an oversoul and a split self. So I guess we're talking semantics here, but I definitely think that various lives may be found in your energy signature, which is you, regardless of what your name is or was.
Well, they also say that the higher person kind of, I won't say splits off a section, but that when you incarnate, you focus on a portion of your karma.
Yes, yeah.
But so because Matthew's life was incomplete in many ways, I think I'm a lot more like him than some people might be. In other words, I'm a lot like him, because I'm still, there was a lot that was left undone that I'm trying to do, like reinstating his legacy, and
I think the basic soul is intact, but you've got different circumstances now. You've got different familial relations. You've got a different body. So everything, you react in accordance with that, but you are still essentially the same, maybe working on some different problems.
Right, but they're not too different in my case.
Really?
Pretty similar. I'm still working on the same line of karma, apparently.
And what would that be?
Well, I think that Matthew had I can think of three big themes. One of them was that he and his wife, Abby, wanted to bring spiritual understanding to humanity.
Well, this is a good time to try and do that.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to stop you right there, Stephen. We're at the bottom of the hour. We're going to take a quick break, and we're talking to Stephen Sakellarios. And when we come back, we're going to get into how Matthew's wife, Abby, has helped Stephen in this present timeline. So don't go away. We'll be right back.
Supernatural Magazine, one of the UK's top paranormal magazines, provides support to Spirit Radio, the Paranormal Experience. It is the magazine's goal to bring every aspect of supernatural news and research from around the world under one roof to create a universal platform for all those interested in the supernatural. More information is available at supernaturalmagazine.com. And you are listening to Spirit Radio, the Paranormal Experience, with your hosts, Willie Hassell and Lynn Nickerson, on WSCA 106.1 FM in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Hey, we're back.
Hey.
he confused me. Dark Side of the Moon time.
Sorry.
Oh, that's right. I'm very easily confused. So anyway, we're back. Spirit Radio, the Paranormal Experience. We're talking tonight about reincarnation with our guest, Stephen Sakellarios. You know, people have told me I was a
Viking.
A Viking. That was one of them. A Viking.
Raping, pillaging, all that stuff.
Raping and pillaging and
Yeah.
all kinds of fun stuff. And I was a sea captain and, you know, neat
I
stuff.
think he still looks like a Viking.
I'd buy the sea captain for sure.
You're a sea
Yeah.
captain, you think so? Yeah.
And a Civil War general, I believe it was a general. A Civil War officer.
I'd buy that too.
An
Yeah.
officer and a gentleman.
They didn't say that, Willie.
Willie has a presence, you guys.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. He does.
All right,
Well-
so back to our guest,
Yes,
Stephen Sakellarios.
We were talking about Matthew Franklin Whittier and his wife, Abby. She was deceased in 1841. But before we get into how she helped Stephen out, I think it's important that you mention The Raven and A Christmas Carol.
Well, as I said, one of the big agendas that Matthew had with Abby was to bring spirituality to the public. And she in particular, she taught him. He was a philosopher, but he was a skeptic. She was the spiritual one that had the faith, and she taught him. And I found quite a number of her short stories, and they all take a particular unfortunate type of person or a social problem and address that social problem in a compassionate way. Each one of them could be somebody who's physically disabled, could be somebody who's mentally disabled, could be a little Irish orphan girl that's very smart but can't get an education. I mean, these are actual examples. Another one was a young woman who had been in a wealthy family, and her family fell on hard times, and she ended up having to work as a seamstress, but then her musical talent kind of saved the day, and she got adopted by another couple.
Oh, that's neat. That's a nice ending.
I mean, there's several of these stories. So I think that her idea was to make plays, and that this is just a feeling, and that these plays were going to get put on for churches and community groups, and that they would go around and spread, and that would kind of help to transform society. I think that was her original idea. A Christmas Carol, as near as I can tell, and I could go into my reasons for this, but as near as I can tell, it was written in Methuen. It was written in a farmhouse that belonged to Matthew's second cousin, Richard Whittier, also John Greenleaf Whittier's second cousin. They had lost their first child in a local anyway, in an outbreak, a little plague, scarlet fever. It was. And they were recuperating, and Matthew needed something to help distract her. And the only thing that would distract her was the philanthropic urge to help other people, to get her out of herself. So they had written several stories. He'd written some kind of along this line. I call it the personal transformation genre, the redemption genre. He'd written some. She'd written some that were more, they had the occult in them, and they were more metaphysical. His were not. His had things like somebody was a drunkard and was ruining his family, and then he heard the church bells and it transformed him, a couple like that. And it was like treatments, that he's working with this idea. She had one, quite a few, I've described them. So they both were coming at it from different directions, so I think they decided to collaborate, and that became A Christmas Carol. And the way it got to Dickens was that after she died, the year after she died, Dickens came to Boston. Matthew was a fan. I know. He was friends with Oliver Wendell Holmes. Oliver Wendell Holmes was one of the people that was in the circle.
Yeah.
And Matthew is known as a brilliant conversationalist. His daughter said that he was a brilliant conversationalist. So, of course, Oliver would have invited him. So he would have been one of the unnamed young writers. And by that time, Matthew had been publishing for 9 years, so he wasn't, he published before Dickens did, actually.
Yeah.
So he was there. And he had this manuscript, and he had this idea, and this came up in hypnosis, way back at the beginning of the study. What he felt was, if he could get Dickens to take this thing, he could fulfill Abby's wish to have it spread beyond anything she could ever have hoped for. In other words, it would get a worldwide audience instead of just being sent around to little communities and put on as a play.
Dickens evidently had already been published by that time, I take it, right?
Yeah, in 42, he was known.
Okay.
He was what they call lionized. I mean, when he got to Boston, he was a big celebrity already.
Okay.
But he was in debt as of 1843.
Really?
He was very much afraid of going into debt. So he needed what they call a potboiler. He needed something to get him out of debt.
Yeah.
And I know that he was given a lot of manuscripts when he was in the States, not just that one, but people would pile them on him, And he must have gone through them to see if he could find something that would get him out of debt. And he noticed the Whittier name, which was known. Wasn't the same Whittier, it was the brother, but he noticed the name, and he started reading it, and he says, I think I can make a crowd pleaser out of this that'll get me out of debt. And he revised it in 6 weeks.
So that was Abby's work.
It was Abby's and Matthew's,
second...
And I can tell you which part she wrote and which part he wrote. He wrote all the funny stuff. It opens up, and the author at the beginning starts to philosophize about the phrase "dead as a doornail" and so on. That's Matthew. But when you get to the ghosts, Marley's ghost and the other guy, and they give speeches. They've been called sermons. Mm-hmm. And William Makepeace Thackeray said something to the effect that they were the best sermons in the world. When you get to those sermons, that's Abby. And I've got things that she wrote that you can see the style. That's her. And not only that, but I've got one here that I could read if we want to. This is The Ghost of Christmas Future.
Okay.
And this is Abby, but Dickens modified it. And you can see in the scribble and his handwritten manuscript where and how he modified it.
You saw the manuscript?
I've got it here. I show it to you.
Oh, wonderful.
So, you can find it online, Dickens' manuscript. And but it's very hard to see what he had written before because he scribbled it on a very heavy everything he scribbled out on a very heavy corkscrew. But because it's in Flash online, you can zoom in and you can make this stuff out now, see? So, and I've got a Xerox of it that I'll show you in a minute when we get, if I can find it. It'll take me a couple seconds. But anyway, I'm going to read this little section that Abby wrote. This is The Ghost of Christmas Future. It's just a little paragraph. O cold, cold, rigid, dreadful death, set up thine altar here and dress it with such terrors as thou hast at thy command. For this is thy dominion. But of the loved, revered, and honored head thou canst not turn one hair to thy dread purposes or make one feature odious. It is not that the hand is heavy and will fall down when released. It is not that the heart and pulse are still, but that the hand was open, generous and true, the heart brave, warm and tender, and the pulse a man's. Strike, shadows, strike, and see his good deeds springing from the wound to sow the world with life immortal. Now, that's Abbey.
Yeah, that does sound like
Abbey.
Yeah.
Watered down by Dickens because he took out the spiritual part. It used to say, let's see, where he has to sow the world with life immortal, she had something about the soul set free immortal. He scratched out the soul because he was a materialist, and Abbey was spiritual. You see?
Yeah.
So it makes a lot more sense with Abbey because what she's saying is the soul is set free, no matter what death tries to do. See, she believed it. Dickens didn't even believe in life after death, necessarily. I mean, he didn't know, but he was so against spiritualism. His friends tried to trick him to see Daniel Douglas Hume. He is a physical medium, very powerful physical medium that one time was seen floating out the second-story window and floating back in another window.
Truly?
That's how good Daniel Douglas Hume was. And I think I have some evidence that Matthew was personal friends with him because Matthew was in the spiritualist movement. Later, after Abbey died, he believed everything she taught him.
Yeah.
At the time, when she first started trying to teach him, he was skeptical. But anyway, that was Abbey. See. So when you read Marley's Ghost, but see, if you look at that story, see, now you got me going, my topic. If you look at that story, you will see earthbound spirits. You will see karma. I wear the chains I forged in life. That's karma. You will see all of the. You will see a life review.
Yeah.
When you will see all, and these things were known back then.
Yeah.
This isn't just a New Age thing. These things were known in the 1830s by people who'd studied. All of that Abbey put into this work, and that was not Matthew's part. That was Abbey's part. And she had written the occult in her stories before. Dickens had no idea about any of this stuff. He mocked it by subtitling it a ghost story of Christmas. That's all it was to him, was a ghost story. It is obvious that he could not possibly have written that story if you look at the spirituality.
Yeah.
And you look at who Dickens was.
But how did it get called a Christmas Carol?
Well, Matthew's stories that he partly patterned this on had to do with people hearing Christmas bells or New Year's bells, and that transformed the person. He's got two stories like that. The New Year's bells and I can't remember the titles of the stories, but I mean, that was his idea, that somebody would hear these Christmas bells and that it would suddenly transform them as a person, waken their heart. So, and Abbey was a musical prodigy as well as being a literary prodigy. She sang, she played the harp, she played piano very well, apparently. So I think that they decided to call it a carol. I think that was original.
That makes a lot of sense. And the other thing that demystifies it is the fact that Dickens came here to the States and joined that circle of writers. And I can see how the connection was made, because I wasn't sure how you drew that conclusion.
Well, there's also, I think it's the Pilgrim edition of Dickens' 3-volume set of letters, published letters, there is a record of a thank you to Matthew Franklin Whittier for a letter. So we know that Matthew wrote him a letter. We know there was a direct connection.
Oh, boy, that's super. Okay, so
and that's the one that I haven't proven as well. the famous one that I say. This is the thing. I just say these things because he's nuts. I tell them I have evidence, they don't want to hear it because he's nuts. That's the one I can't prove as well. The other one I can prove better.
The other one being?
The other one being The Raven.
The Raven.
After Abbey's death in March of 1841, Matthew wrote a series of tribute poems to her about her death, about his faith crisis, about their courtship. And he apparently, because he'd had what he viewed as a success with Dickens, he didn't think of himself as having been taken advantage of. He thought it was a great success. So he started apparently sending his stuff off to the literati, see? Some of whom probably gave for feedback, like everybody does, And I think his feeling was, let's say that if I had written a song on my guitar and I'd sent it to the Beatles, and they used it, I would be thrilled. I wouldn't feel like they plagiarized me. I would be thrilled, So I think he had that attitude at first. Dickens was not that nice a guy when you look at his character. It turns out, And I've got stuff in my book about that. But one of the poems that Matthew wrote after Abby's death was The Raven. I can prove this. That one I can't quite prove. This one I can prove.
Right.
So
why don't we touch on that?
Yeah, let's do that. Of course, I mean I can't give all 21.
No, but give a couple of examples if you would.
But what that poem is about is his faith crisis. And it's literal.
And he's being haunted too, right?
Well, he
by
hopes
her death.
He hopes for a visitation from her, but he's also afraid of it.
Yep.
So when he hears a scratching at the window, he thinks maybe that's it. And now I don't know that a raven literally came in. I think all of that is symbolic. Maybe there was one out there, But
I think
the rest
he was
of it's
haunted
symbolic.
by the idea of her death, and that's what the raven represents.
Yeah, the raven represents death. I mean,
Okay.
but here's the thing. From my research, it looks as though his mother was very superstitious. And I'll give you an example of that. This might be interesting to you, that the historians gleefully mention that the boys were called by their middle names, Franklin and Greenleaf. Well, I got a past life hit on that. I said the reason for that is that they were afraid that the devil would get you if the boy's name was said. That's what I felt. It was a superstition. And from that, I kept kind of looking and kind of being aware of that. And it looks as though she was superstitious. And they weren't. And for example, there's a story about John Greenleaf Whittier hoeing in the field, and he's daydreaming. He's thinking up a poem or something, right? And his father says, "That's enough for stand now, John." I can't say it with the accent, but, that's what he says. So he called him John. They called each other by their names, but when they referred to each other, "Has Greenleaf come home yet? What is Franklin doing?" They would use the middle names because of that superstition. That's what I think.
That's an interesting interpretation. I've never heard of that.
So the raven was one of the superstitions. Anything about the devil, I think
their
mother,
name.
you don't say the name, and they were superstitious. And I know that by inference because Matthew made very fast and loose with the idea of the devil in his humorous writings. He really, broke all the rules with that. He would make all kinds of fun about that.
I think they too were, they felt that saying the name would be a welcoming.
Right. They didn't want to
it.
invite him, yeah. So I think that's why Matthew picked up on that and called it the raven, because that was death, symbol for death and an omen. I mean, they were considered an omen, see.
So how did Edgar Allan Poe get a hold of it?
Okay, here we go. I got to take a little time with this. You cut me off if we take too much time with this, but I can tell you that I have finally figured out that Matthew was living in New York in 1845, from the end of 1844. He was writing essays and reviews for the New York Tribune.
Okay.
New York Tribune is one block away from the Evening Mirror, which Poe wrote critiques for. So they were both critics. And they were one block over. Their buildings were one block away at the time.
And Poe was in New York too.
Yeah.
Okay, I thought he came from
and the
Pennsylvania.
American, I don't remember. No, Virginia, I think.
Virginia. Okay,
Yeah,
but he was in New York at the time.
And okay, so they're both have parallel positions. They're both there, but I have to go back because he was writing under an old pseudonym, a star, a single asterisk. He'd used it in the early 1830s. He used it in Portland. He used it all his life, and it symbolized. Abby loved the stars. She wrote about the stars. She believed that the stars were alive, and she believed that they were souls in heaven, or that they were at least representative of souls in heaven. So she must have felt that two stars were hers and his. See? So after she died, he used a star as a secret pseudonym because it referred to Abby's belief about him.
Did he use the word or did he use
No,
an
it's an
asterisk?
Just an asterisk.
Okay.
So he was using that for the the New York Tribune. But all of that work has been attributed to Margaret Fuller, the transcendentalist, who was the literary editor of the paper. And this is one of those cases where the rumor got around that she was the star, see? And she didn't set them straight, and Matthew just made snide remarks about it. But he wouldn't come right out and defend it himself either. He stayed hidden. So all through history, the historians have assumed that rumor was correct. When Matthew left in mid-1846 and he went down to New Orleans, and then he went back to Boston. He kept using it for other papers. He kept on using it because he used it all his life. So he kept right on using it. There was even overlap where he was using it in Boston and in New York at the same time for different papers. When she was sent overseas as the foreign correspondent, she started using it as though it was hers. Okay? So that's just that's an example of how these things happen.
How did she get away with being so prideful?
She had a problem that way.
Yeah.
She was known that way.
Evidently.
She was a prima donna. So anyway, so that was Matthew. 1 month before The Raven is published, Matthew publishes a poem in that paper, in the poetry corner in the back of that paper, which I have a copy of somewhere. I could read like one stanza of it, if I can find it. In the same style. He had written one earlier in that same style, and that was his preferred style. I don't know if I'm going to be able to find that.
And what is the title of it?
The one, I've got it. Let me find it.
Okay, well, while you're looking
you
for that...
You do something for a minute.
Yeah,
rescue me.
we'll just talk amongst ourselves, me and Willie.
Yeah.
Before we go, I do want to mention a lot of descendants have some kind of traumatic mark on their body that indicates the relationship to one of their forebears or the person that they were incarnated as previous to the current lifetime. So I wanted to ask Stephen about that, if he thinks he has anything physically that resembles Matthew other than the eyes. Because some people are born with like a birthmark.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, where someone was shot or stabbed or something like that.
Well, I do actually, in a sense. Matthew had what he called dyspepsia, which means stomach, stomach upset,
course,
acid stomach and so on. And I remembered under hypnosis him dying with a very, very sharp stomach pain. But officially his death was supposed to be bladder infection or, kidney infection. I've got all those things. I struggle with them,
Wow.
So, it's not proof. These things aren't proof.
No, it isn't, but
I struggle. And I think it goes back to a much earlier lifetime that I remembered a long time ago when I wanted desperately to learn to play the sitar. And this is in India. And this came to me with Roger Wilger, because I videotaped Roger Wilger, who was a pioneer in past life regression, non-hypnotic past life regression using the Netherton method. And when I videotaped him, it was a seminar. He was, a seminar, and he asked for volunteers, and I raised my hand quick before anybody else could, and he worked with me. And this is one of the ones that came up. So I'm in this school, but they have this weird, austere rule that you have to go through these austerities before you ever get your hand on an instrument.
Austerity?
In other words, you have to be deprived of things.
Oh, okay.
And one of the things is that you have to go long periods of time without going to the bathroom.
That's not right.
But that's what I remember. So I took and this is a pattern that's gone all the way through my life, Matthew's life. It's a mental predisposition. When everybody else is faking it, because it's not possible, I sincerely try to do the thing. And that does two things. It ruins me, and secondly, it makes everybody else really mad at me because I'm making them look bad. See? So they forced me out.
Wow.
So what happened was I messed with my kidneys and my bladder with this thing, so I became a hermit. I'm on the mountainside, and I die of this thing. Of like a blocked urinary tract. That's how I died, as a hermit in the mountains. And
that was previous to?
Way back.
Way
back.
We're talking,
I don't know what we're talking, 1100 or something. So that trauma set up this recurring pattern of,
Yet that's what Farmer's talking about, healing unhealthy family patterns.
Right. Well, this would be a good example.
Exactly, yeah. So you found your poem?
So I found a poem. This appeared in
We've only got a few more minutes left.
About 2 minutes.
December 27, 1844, The Might of Words. What to man his greatness given, or the creeping things and birds, but the soul that in him liveth, and the glory of his words. That's the pattern that he wrote in. Okay? So the Raven is very much in that pattern. I've got earlier ones. I've got later ones. And historians make a point that Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote a poem that has the same pattern and even has a reference to a purple curtain, and they think that Poe stole it from her. Matthew wrote both of those. That's why that same line that was almost identical shows up in both poems. It's the same style. It's a reference to an actual curtain that used to belong to Abby. That's why he keeps mentioning it, because it has personal meaning to him. Wow. There's a whole bunch of I got 20 something
circumstantial
clues.
But pretty strong circumstantial.
Well, but I haven't told you all of them. There's we don't have time.
We don't have a whole lot of time, but I do want to ask you really directly, do you have any strong feelings, or did you ever have any dreams as Matthew from his lifetime?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Did you
when I was Matthew, or did I dream of Matthew?
Did you dream of being Matthew? Did you have a dream where you knew it was a past life incarnation?
I can't think of anything right off the top of my head. Yeah.
Just these innuendos and so forth. And
well, I mean, I've had flashbacks, waking flashbacks, but dreams, no, I don't think so.
Oh, okay. Well, waking flashbacks work.
Yeah.
Can you give me a strong one?
Yeah, but we don't have to. Okay, so the strongest one is that Abby is leading me up some stairs in a house, and halfway up the stairs on the right is a white door like a ship's portal. It's white. It's like a hatch.
Oh, yeah.
And she pulls me into this hatch. There's a small room in there, and we make love in there. And the whole thing was that there's a long story, but she wanted to get pregnant because she was, she'd been basically arrested after they eloped.
Yeah.
And the only way to get out of it, to keep from being sent to boarding school, was to get pregnant. Well, I found that. That's a very, very rare architectural thing, and I found it in the house across the street from where Abby lived, the Countess House on East Haverhill.
And you recognized it?
Yeah, when I saw a picture of the thing, I said,
wow.
It's not at the middle, it's at the top, but it looks like it's in the middle when you look at it from the bottom. And it's in the house next door. That house was on Abby's property across the street, and it's the only place it's not anywhere else.
Now, that is really, really interesting. Thank you for that. That's really interesting when you find something like that. Okay, we're out of time.
Yeah, we are. We're out of time. Stephen, thank you very much for joining us. Pleasure to have you.
Certainly enjoyed it.
Can
people get the book or find the documentary, stuff like that?
Yeah, it's all on the homepage of the website. The books I put up at the top, so they're easy to find. The website is www.ial.goldthread.com, goldthread.com.
And that IAL stands for In Another Life,
right.
In case you want to know.
Okay. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
Thank you.
And that is Spirit Radio, the Paranormal Experience.
And thanks, everyone, for listening. You have a good evening.